That was wonderful, Sharon. Thank you so much. It was great. Good evening, everybody. I was really excited to have Sharon come join us. I hope you've noticed that this is a very special community and that it's a very special place here at Point Reyes. And before I get into my questions, and you've just sparked so many more than we've talked about before, I wanted to share with you a little bit about a tradition we have in Point Reyes, which is what I call the protocols of place. And that is welcome you with reference to the ancestors of the people who have been on this land before others came, and the descendants that are still with us. And in this case, it's the Coast Miwok and the Southern Pomo. And they've recently come together, and they use the word sovereignty. They brought together their tribal people and became the Great Rancheria. And some of you may know Greg Saris, who's the tribal chair of the Great Rancheria, and he said something that I think is a good theme for what you and I, and then we're going to open it up to you. So all of us in this room, what we're going to be doing together. And so I wanted to read to you something he said. It's at the end of Betty Garkey's book on Chief Marin, if you've seen that book. It's very end when they're talking about we're still here, their point. And he said, if we want to identify and mark a place as sacred, we must also see that place as only the beginning, the knot a basket maker ties to start her basket, from which a sacred world rolls out and coils around us in every direction. So I wanted to bring the image in for all of us of this basket weaving that we're going to do as we reconnect place and time and in these perilous times. And thank you for beginning that with us tonight, with what you've contributed. Thank you for that. There's a lot. I'm hesitating because I've been practicing trying to say Gaelic. Can't get it, sorry. All right, another name for her in English is the hag, which we can maybe identify with in the good way, right? And I'm also really excited that you put that into context. One of the things you talk about is that always understanding the story in context. And you brought her up also in terms of the Grail legend. And in this room, I don't know how many people here were listening to Martin Shaw talk about some of those same stories from Parsifal. And one of the stories he talked about was what we call the Dame Ragnall story. And it's a provocative story about women and sovereignty. So let me start there and ask you, if you know the story, the heart of the story is a question that Sir Gawain has to answer in terms of dealing with his marriage with the hag. And then, of course, she turns into a beautiful woman, and there's issues of beauty and aging and what the hag means. So take up on any of that. But could you talk a little bit more about that question at the heart of the story? What do women want?
Yeah, I think, I tend to see this, all of these stories as not being so much about us and our own internal processes and our own internal psychology, but very much about our relationship with the land. And to me, that is seeing it in its context, because I think 100 years of modern psychology has focused us all far too much inside our heads, and we think everything is about us. So when we hear, the answer to that question, what do women want, is sovereignty, we think, well, personal power. And back in the day, it wouldn't have been that. There would have been an element of that, of course. It wasn't that women didn't want to define their own lives and their own ways of being in the world, but sovereignty was very much this kind of sense of it's women who hold the power of the land and the power of the other world in these old stories. So I think for me that's one big part of it, that it's not, we have to. I really think that we have to stop interpreting a lot of these stories that as about internal processes. I love the story of Dame Ragnall particularly, as I do all stories of the characters that we call the loathly lady. That's the name of the motif, because they're all very, very fierce characters with bored tusks and hair all over the place and snakes and one eye and goodness knows what. Some of the descriptions of them are really kind of like they're fairly serious women. It's another one of those myths, I think, about the Grail, the later Grail literature, which everybody these days looks at as, it's about the knight, isn't it? It's all about the knight who goes on the quest for the Holy Grail. And that's been the emphasis over the past couple of centuries, whereas actually you find that it's the women who are the Grail bearers in the first place, and it's the women who are the Grail messengers. So the loathly lady comes out of the woods or whatever to basically tell the knight all of the ways in which he's going wrong, all of the ways in which he's self-centered, in which he's above himself, in which he really needs to shape up and get back on the true path. So I think all of these so-called loathly ladies and hags are very, very powerful characters, again, that are quite misunderstood. These are the women that are really shaping the action. So it looks like a hero story, but actually it's the women who represent the land, who represent the otherworldly power, which is what the Grail is, after all, in context. That's another, I could rant about that, I shan't, I'll stop here. It's very much about, the Grail is in its oldest form, before a Christian legend of Joseph of Arimathea and the chalice at the Last Supper started to be superimposed upon it. The Grail was very much this concept of otherworldly, life-giving energy into the land. And it was women that bore it.
And what goes right in that story is that Sir Gawain says to the hag, you get to do it your way. And so it turns it back to the woman and respects her power. And I'm thinking that's also like, when you were telling the story of the wells and the maiden of the wells, I wanted to get up there and go, how do we protect the maidens of the wells? How do we protect our waters? This is something I do in my work a lot, is working with the return of the salmon in the rivers up in Northern California and the waters that have been dammed and polluted. We know that story. And that story just fed me so deeply because it is often women's work. So how do we bring that back here? I mean, let's get into maybe some of these perilous times aspects of the stories. How would you bring the stories to the work we do in our communities as we want to rebalance water and fire, for instance? Just to say, I just went to fall ceremony with the tribe I work with up near Reading, and in the midst of horrible smoke and the car fire, the Mendocino complex fire, we did fire and water dance. And the point of it is, and the point of a lot of the fall ceremonies are to bring the world back into balance. That's part of their prayers they put down every year for thousands of years here. And so this is also what you're bringing to us here, is to, how do we bring water and fire back into balance, for instance?
Yeah, I'm going to sidestep that a little bit, I suppose. I'm answering your question, but maybe from a different perspective, because I see my job very much as using story to inspire people, to capture people's imagination. And back in the days when I was practicing as a psychologist, which didn't last very, very long, but it was very clear to me that the only way that you are going to create lasting change, lasting transformation in people, which they can then take out into the world, is by capturing their imagination. And of course, too much modern psychology, too much modern therapy doesn't capture the imagination at all. And so often changes that people make are very, very short-lived. If you can capture the imagination, you can make people see other possibilities, other ways of being, other ways of telling their own story, other ways of being in the world, other outcomes in the world. Then all of a sudden, people start to perceive the possibility of change. And so to me, the stories that I work with, I think are very powerful for people, because it in a world, particularly for women, which is what we're talking about, in a world where women for centuries have been deprived of their voice and deprived of their power, it offers us a memory of a time when that was different. And I think that's important, because if we're trying to recreate something, trying to create something that never existed before, it seems like a much bigger hurdle than to say, no, we had it once, we have the right to that. That is embedded in the land, it's embedded in our ancestry. We can become that again. Then I think, to me, these images are things that people can take with them, and they give a lot of the people that I talk to who work with them, it gives them a greater sense of confidence, a greater sense of power, a greater sense of agency to become again the voices of the wells, to become again the protectors of the water, because that's what our ancient heritage tells us. So for me, it's very much, rather than, saying a specific set of actions that ought to be done, it's very much about capturing imagination so that people feel empowered, which is a word I hate, but I can't think of another one, to get out there and be something.
Well, right, because you started out with talking about the maidens who protected the wells, and then you landed on this really important concept of reciprocity, that there was a responsibility that the people were taking in order to keep things in balance, right? And so, and then, that image, of course, that we have with our current wounded leader, badly wounded. I mean, it just really felt like it just spoke to our time. And I think, so I guess I was invoking, how does the water and the well story and the wounded fisher king and those things come to, and you answered that. It brings us into a sense that there is a balance.
Yeah.
And I think that's what I was like. There really is a balance, and we can believe in that. We can participate in that.
Sure, and
we
also that this has all happened before. It's not new.
Right.
These are old stories, clearly, of perilous times that have a different face and a different shape, but it's happened before. I think, to me, one of the things that I love about these old stories, and you may not all agree with me, is that they do allow for consequences. And I think, they show that a little bit of wrath in the right place is necessary sometimes to wake people up and to see that there really will be consequences if we keep doing this. And I think too often, a lot of modern stories are a little bit too much love and light, and sometimes you need the blue-faced hag to actually bite and say, no, you may not do that, or there are going to be consequences. So they're gentle in many ways, but she is an uncompromising figure. She will not have it. You may not pass. And I think that's a really powerful image, particularly for older women, who often feel perhaps more disempowered than anybody in these cultures, to find that very strong archetype as a gatekeeper. Literally, you may not do this.
And that hag is also, she has a season to her. She's about the winter and the darker times. And
only in the Scottish tradition.
Okay.
Interestingly, in Ireland, she doesn't have that inimical kind of like tradition. She's slightly gentler. She's still very fierce, but she's slightly gentler. She doesn't. Her creatures are cattle, probably more than deer. But you see, that reflects the society, because Ireland at that time, its whole economy was very much dependent on cattle, whereas Scotland didn't have that. It had more deer in the mountains. So in Ireland, she reflects the nature of the society.
But where I was headed with that too is that she represents these cycles of life, and as an aging woman myself, I need models for reclaiming that power of being able to say, no, we can't do this. I mean, it's something that I wanted to ask you more. You talk a lot about the gendered landscape. And so, and I think a lot of people here, some of my friends that I know, go out into the land to get refreshed and to get a sense of ourselves and to restore ourselves when we do the hard work of trying to bring things back into balance. And that she speaks to me in that land. But as we go ahead into the darker times, as I pick the seeds from my garden and the plants are all getting very ugly and dried up, and I'm like, okay, I can relate to that, right? And so, so it really helps us to know that there's these archetypal stories feeding us encouragement that it's okay to get old. Right?
For sure, and it's not just in the Celtic mythology too. I mean, throughout Europe, think of Baba Yaga, for example. I mean, there's a character. In the Slavic tradition, Europe has a lot of very serious, interesting old women. And what's curious to me is that a lot of the younger women I work with and tell these stories to find those old women to be creatures that they want to be. It's not like, it's something almost to aspire to, which is wonderful, because we've been taught to think of aging as a failure. Exactly. Basically a cumulative failure. You fail more and more and more until you die. That's great. Well, that old hag isn't having any of that. Right? So, it's great. It shows you a character that you want to be, that you can grow into that fierceness, that you can grow into that sense of rightness. And judgment, yeah.
Thank you for that. You also talk a little bit in some of your writing about being an apprentice to story. Can you tell us a little bit more about what that means for you, how you work? And one of the reasons I was really attracted to your work, in particular, Sharon, is that you're scholarly about it. You know, you're not ripping off the images and just presenting them for commercial benefit or something. You know, you're deeply involved in studying and bringing us authenticity to your storytelling. So what does your apprenticeship to story mean? And tell us a little bit more about what it's like for you to do that.
I think, well, to be honest, I really started to focus on this and kind of bang on about it a lot when I realised just how much utter tosh there was on the web about Celtic mythology. So almost anything, I can guarantee you, almost anything you find on the web that claims to be about Celtic mythology will probably be wrong, because a lot of people take it out of context, and so they tell stories with the best intentions in the world. They tell stories, and so, for example, they think that things like sovereignty means personal power. There's no way, you know, if you understood the context of those stories and the absolute focus of people in those countries on relationship with the land, there's no way that you could interpret it that way. And I think if we're going to actually make these stories meaningful, we have to understand the context in which they were told. We have to understand what our ancestors were thinking, you know, what the social situations were, what their psychology would have been when they wrote those stories. Now, that's not to say that those stories must be static and that we don't kind of like, you know, bring what we can out of them for the times, but it's really important to understand where they came from. So that whole thing of the Grail story, you know, being very much about the knight and the women, you couldn't possibly take that from the women being just a kind of like side characters. You couldn't possibly take that from the knowledge of the context of, you know, the rest of the whole body of literature at the time. You would see it in a very, very different way. So to me, I suppose, apprenticeship to stories really means delving, rather than just rushing to interpret them, or interpreting them, you know, in modern ways for modern concerns, is to really just think about why those stories would have been important, what might have been important about them, what might our ancestors have known that we don't know anymore, because I think a lot of the rush to interpret stories, particularly, you know, I always call myself a recovering Jungian, particularly in the Jungian tradition, it's a rush to interpret them for modern psychological damage, and that's not what they were about. And so to me that's a little bit of a, it's okay at one level, but it seems a little bit disrespectful to the nature of the story. So it's very much about looking at a story, seeing where it came from, seeing who told it, why they might have told it, really sitting with it for a while, thinking about who the characters are, who the archetypes are, and then, okay, seeing how it might relate to, you know, to ourselves and our world today. Apprenticeship is a much underrated thing today, isn't it? You know, we all want everything. We want like an instant, so like a weekend workshop, and then we become everything we always wanted to be. And all of the best old, it's not just the myths that I'm talking about, but all of the best old fairy tales are about apprenticeship. You know, the young girl has to apprentice herself to the shoemaker for 7 long years before he makes the studded shoes that will allow her to scale the glass mountain to get to the other side and find her lost love. Apprenticeship is critical to all of these old stories, and again, we can learn something from that. I think it's something that we need to regain as well.
A lot of the indigenous teachers that I work with talk about sacred places as learning places, teaching places. So how do you, just following up on what you're saying, how do you, when you're out on the land, learn without all those preconceptions from, you know, of our modern mind and the distractions of today and all of that? When you go out into the land where you are in Ireland, how do you learn from the land and engage with that as you're reconnecting the way you've recommended to us? We have to re-engage, right, and reconnect, and it's about the land. Tell us a little bit about your personal process in that.
Okay, I mean, to be honest, most of that is the subject of tomorrow, of the workshop
Well,
tomorrow, but I know that not everybody is going to be there, so kind of briefly, I think in countries like Ireland it's easier perhaps than in countries like this, because these stories that I'm talking about, as I said, they're 1,500 years old in their written form, and there would have been an oral tradition for centuries. So those stories are kind of like embedded in the land. They've been there. There is a history of relationship between people and the land that is still alive and strong today in Ireland. It's not so much, sadly, so in other Celtic countries quite to the same degree. But Ireland is still a very intensely rural country, and if you could define it by anything, it's by people's relationship with the land. And so it's as if there's an openness, of the land. The stories are there, you only have to go out and find them. So every part of Ireland has a great tradition of place law, which you see in native communities here in this part of the world as well. It's exactly the same way we are. We have our place names, our moral teachings often, not just how a place came to be named, but what it means, why. There's always a moral story attached to it. So it's very, very easy to find. I think if you have no tradition in a place, no ancestral tradition in a place, there's a different kind of story, which is superimposed upon that, which is the story of your relationship with the land, the story of what happened to you there, the story of your own individual place names. A rock might have a particular story associated with it by a different people 1,500 years old, but what is that rock to you? What does it say to you? How do you name it? So it's kind of like, it's really difficult to do this, and briefly, it's kind of like a superimposition of your own personal stories of your presence on the land on top of the old stories. And to me, it's a question very much, it's apprenticing yourself to the land as well. It's not blundering in, it's giving yourself time to sit with a rock, to sit with a tree, to listen in all kinds of ways that we will be talking about tomorrow, and listening for those stories. Because I think, although I spend a lot of time talking about old stories, I'm very much with the idea that these stories are not static. It's not like stories end 1,500 years ago because we've got these documents that were written down. Stories shift and change with people over time, and they have to. I remember reading Leslie Marmon Silko's very wonderful book, Ceremony. Do you remember where she has her medicine man, Bethany, is it? And he is talking about ceremony, and to me what he says about ceremony is absolutely the same for stories. And he says if the ceremonies don't change, basically everything becomes static and they die. They basically don't work anymore. Well, that's true for stories. They have to change. But they have to change in an authentic way, by being in the land, by listening to it, not just by blundering in and kind of like making them. So, I'm sorry, I'm trying to cram a lot into a short answer. I don't know whether that makes any sense.
Well, it did, and I think there's so many protocols and permissions and things that different traditions have as a way of accessing that. And I think that sometimes if you're an immigrant, you might not know those things of that place, and we're struggling, I think, in our generation. I'm thinking of the long term. My dad was born in 1891, it's a long time ago, and he came west in about 1910 and built the lodges at Glacier National Park. And he lived with the Blackfeet at the time. And I've been searching in family archives for a really long time, and just last week I found the pictures and the letters and the evidence of his time there. And I'd heard it, how you hear a story when you're a kid and you think, yeah. And yet I've spent 40 years now working with Native people, and so I'm like, well, this is something, a lineage here. There's something going on that I was inspired perhaps by my dad's stories. And his generation was really different, I mean, I think John Muir was alive when he was alive, and so it was a different sense of the environmental community, the conservation movement at the time, and now we have the things that we've been doing in this community here that I relate to very much, and then we have these younger people who are a completely different idea about it, and I've seen the younger Native people relate very differently. When I first started working in the 70s, there was still a lot of anger and a lot of pain, and the wounds of the past were really right out front. And that's receding a little bit, and there's more interaction, and there's more permission, there's more storytelling, as the Great Rancheria comes in, and they're sharing these stories, and Stephen and Kate have brought them in with us, and Sky Webb and people like that, have welcomed this. And so I see it shifting, and I think I'm part of, the woman I worked with told me, well, you're like a link, and each of us becomes a link. So I want you to bring your tradition into that you study into this. It's like as we pass through these generations, we're healing ourselves, we're healing our communities, and we're healing the land through remembering what our relationships are and how we can go forward. So
yeah, I think I think it's very important clearly to have some sense of the stories pre-existing in the land, whether they're your ancestors' stories or the stories of other indigenous peoples. I think it's my own perspective on it is that it's the stories of the land though don't stop with anybody. So the stories of the land and people's relationship with the land are always ongoing. And I do very strongly believe, I am a bit of a mystic when it comes to land, there's no question about it, as you'll find tomorrow if you're in the workshop. I believe that the land wants to be in relationship with anybody who's on it. It doesn't matter who they are. Even if you got there in an unfortunate way, which let's face it, happened very clearly in these countries, the point is that you're here on the land, and the land needs to be in relationship with the people. That's very clear from all of the traditions, I think, of indigenous peoples around the world. It's very clear from our own traditions. The land requires you to be in relationship with it. Otherwise, what are you? You're not grounded, you're not rooted, you make no sense apart from the land. So I think it's very important, without disrespecting the pre-existing stories of the land, without overwriting them, because they don't have to be overwritten, to add onto that, your own stories. I remember reading a long time ago now some really interesting work that was going on in Australia, where settler anthropologists were working with the Aboriginal nations that were still living in very traditional ways to talk about this, this concept basically of their stories going in parallel with the Aboriginal stories, and no need for any conflict between them, because their relationship with the land was different and their stories were different, and one didn't have to kind of like cancel out the other. Everybody had their own way of relating to the land, and the land was open to everything, and I believe the land is open to everything. So none of this is about kind of like where you come from or what your genetic lineage is. It's about the place where your feet are planted and the responsibility that we have to be in relationship with that land, because otherwise how will we value it?
thank you. You've woven in all of our different threads for this. I think that you wanted to end with a sense of weaving, a story you had to bring us to close to this part of our conversation.
Yeah, it's just a story that's a little bit more hopeful than the one I started with, which would be difficult. And it's also a story about an old woman. And I stole this. I think, from Michael Mead, which is a good person to steal it from, because I'd heard similar stories in my own tradition, and so I took what Michael had said and I wove it in with some stuff from stories from the Scottish tradition, not the Irish tradition, and this is kind of like my version of this mishmash of story, and it's called When Things Fall Apart. If you've read The Enchanted Life, you may know it. And it's a story about a place way, way west of these lands, way, way west of all lands. It's about an island way, way out in the Western Sea. And on the westernmost shore of those islands, there's a set of cliffs, very high cliffs. And it's said that if you stand on top of those cliffs, if you're very, very lucky and the weather is right and the time is right and the light shifts, you might, looking out to the west, see the land of women, Tír na Man, in the Irish tradition. And they say also that on those cliffs somewhere is a cave, a big old cave, and in that cave lives the old woman of the world. And nobody finds her very much these days, although a lot of people die trying, but they say that she still lives there. And if you were to find this cave, big, black, dark opening, and you were to go inside it, you would find the old woman of the world at work making the most beautiful tapestry that the world has ever seen. And she'd be weaving it with all kinds of beautiful coloured threads, all kinds of sparkling threads, but on the bottom of the weaving she's making a fringe made of sea urchin quills, because the old woman of the world knows perfectly well that everything beautiful has to have its sharpness in order to really work. So the old woman of the world is trying to make the most beautiful tapestry the world has ever seen. But on the other side of the cave, there's a big fire. And over this fire, there's a big pot. And in this pot are all of the seeds and herbs of all of the growing things of the world. And the old woman also tends this fire. So every now and again she finds herself getting so caught up in her beautiful weaving that the pot starts to splutter and she begins to smell a little bit of burning, and so she leaves the weaving alone and she goes over to the fire and she stirs the pot. But what you might not have seen, unless you looked very carefully when you went into the cave, is that way up in the top right-hand corner, somebody else is occupying that cave. And it's a big black bird, and his name is Trickster Crow. Now, Trickster Crow doesn't really remember how long he and the old woman have been together, and neither does the old woman, but neither of them can remember a time when they weren't living together somewhere, somehow. When the old woman leaves the weaving behind and goes over to the fire, Trickster Crow jumps down from his perch on the top of the cave and looks at that weaving, and his eyes wide. It's very, very beautiful. Finds the beautiful shiny threads, the best one that he can find, and he pecks at it, pulls at it, pulls this thread. There's another beautiful, bright, shiny thread, pulls that thread. Out it comes. By the time the old woman's finished stirring the pot, the whole tapestry, the most beautiful tapestry in the world, is in shreds on the floor. So what does the old woman do? Does she weep? Does she wail? Does she say she'll never make anything so beautiful again and sit down in despair? No. She looks at all of the threads on the floor till she finds one that catches her eye, one that's a particularly fine shade of blue, one that's a particularly fine shade of green over there, and before she knows it, the old woman of the world is starting to make the most beautiful tapestry that the world has ever seen. Because what she knows, because Trickster Crow knows, is that if the old woman of the world actually did make the most beautiful, perfect tapestry that the world had ever seen, the world would end. And so Trickster Crow keeps on pecking